Hi, Misha here, and originally this was going to be a relatively brief, maybe 15-20 minute update to the EF-111 Aardvark, a very advanced jet fighter back in the 1960s, originally intended for naval use by the U.S. Navy and tactical bombing use by the U.S. Air Force. Really, it served in other capacities, at least more famously. And a year or two ago, I did a video on this model on the right. All three of these are 1/72 scale die-cast. But I quickly realized to even do justice, I would need to cover each of these variants in more time than really one video can be. So this is going to be a three-parter, and this is going to be part one. So they'll kind of be chronological. On the left, we have an F-111, I can find it here, hands. I don't want to knock these because the stands are a little wobbly. There we go. Blind guys, yeah. On the left here, we have an F-111G. This was originally an FB-11 strategic bomber variant, later a tactical bomber variant, and then it ended its life in the Australian Royal Air Force. In the middle, we have an EF-111A, so-called Raven. This began life as an F-111A, an early variant, a tactical bomber, fighter bomber, whatever you'd like to call it. And then it was reworked to be an electronics warfare aircraft, either for defense or offense. And actually this model would be the last variant to be retired in America, and saw extensive use in the Gulf War. And then finally, the one we kind of initially looked at. This is an RF-111C. It began life as an F-111C, built for the Royal Australian Air Force as a long-range bomber with high accuracy. And then it was converted into a photo reconnaissance bird in 1979 and used for another 3 decades nearly. So quite a bit of history. All were originally built, of course, in America by General Dynamics. And the EF-111A was converted by Grumman. And really, considering that just over 560 Aardvarks were built, it's amazing just how many variants there really have been over the years. And it's had a very colorful career. So at this first part, with the preamble out of the way, let's talk about the electronic warfare variant. The Raven was one of the most successful variants in the United States Air Force. Not to make this too long and go way into the development history of the F-111, because it is a long process. It dates back to the early 1960s. At that time, the U.S. Air Force needed a long-range tactical bomber, fighter bomber, penetration fighter, what have you, to replace the F-105 Thunder Chief and a few other units. And the Navy needed a long-endurance fleet protector, interceptor, capable of delivering better missiles, more powerful missiles. Of course, they would ultimately fill this role with the F-14, and it had the Sparrow and the Phoenix. But for a while, the new Kennedy administration, specifically Robert McNamara in 1961, basically ordered that the two branches share a fighter. And the idea was that it would first be built to satisfy the Air Force, and then modified to satisfy the Navy. Obviously, this wasn't really going to work well. But nevertheless, the TFX, Tactical Fighter Experimental Program, went underway. The Air Force and the Navy did agree to engines. They wanted variable geometry wings. The Air Force wanted this so it could take off and land at forward, rough, short airfields. And the Navy wanted it because aircraft carriers. They also agreed on a two-man crew. And that was about it. Everything else they needed was pretty well different from each other. The contract for what would become the F-111 was eventually awarded to General Dynamics. Several companies submitted designs, and it was kind of narrowed down to General Dynamics and Boeing, and actually quite a few in the Air Force wanted the Boeing. But again, the White House intervened, and politics, and so the General Dynamics was selected. Long story short, the design was finalized, and the first XF-111A prototype flew at the end of 1964 for the Air Force, and the navalized version would fly in the middle of 1965. Now, the navalized version, the XF-111B, actually a lot of the naval work was done by Grumman, because General Dynamics had basically no experience with naval planes. Okay, so let's just say in 1968, the Navy finally got fed up and canceled it. And now that the Kennedy administration was out of the way, they could do it. And this led to the F-14. Now, interestingly, the F-14 did borrow quite a bit from the F-111 because Grumman worked on it too, including the variable geometry wings, the type of engine, the TF-30 engine, and some of the electronic systems, so on and so forth. And this was an advanced plane for its day. It had a very advanced terrain-following radar. It had afterburning engines, and it was the first production military plane to go into service with the variable geometry wings. And it was set up originally to be used by Tactical Air Command, TAC, in the Air Force to go in for long duration missions, deliver a heavy payload with pinpoint accuracy, and make it out safely. Like I said, it was designed to be better than planes like the F-105 Thunder Chief. The very first planes were delivered to the Air Force in 1967, and the first half dozen were sent to Vietnam in 1968 for some early field trials, and they did very poorly. In fact, of the 6 sent, 3 were lost, killing 2 of the crews. Turns out the rear stabilizer, the horizontal part specifically, was failing in flight, and so they had to kind of revise it quickly. But to be fair to General Dynamics and the men who worked hard on this design, even though it was already over budget and overdue by 1968, 1969, once it did reappear in 1971 and was used again in Vietnam in 1972, it had a very good success rate and a very good safety record. So with the rocky start out of the way, by 1973, and by the time of the end of the Vietnam War, production was heading out just fine, and it was a well-respected plane. And honestly, it was so advanced for its day that these problems kind of were to be expected. So, what about the EF-111A here? Well, in the late 60s, the Air Force was looking for a new electronics warfare aircraft to replace its aging EB-66 destroyers, and EB-57 Canberras, namely the 66 though. It did look at the Navy's EA-6 Prowler, the A-6's cousin, but again, the two services had such different needs that this time it's the Air Force that looked and said, this doesn't suit what we need. So after playing around with it, it was decided around 1972 to convert some of the F-111A's first, early production models to this new electronics warfare. And the two contenders to do this were General Dynamics, naturally, and Grumman, who also had some knowledge of the airplane. And in 1974, Grumman was awarded the contract. It was first to convert two for test purposes. And this went well, and therefore they were, given a full go-ahead, and the first plane flew in 1977, and the last of the conversions, which would ultimately number 42, would be delivered in 1985. So what do we do? Well, originally the F-111A had an internal bomb bay. This was filled with the central electronics, the computer system, and then a new housing underneath with arrays, antenna, projectors was installed. There was also this big boom on the back of the tail installed. And it no longer could support weapons. These were unarmed. But the only thing the wing pylons were used for were fuel tanks. And the left seater was the pilot, and the right seater was the electronic warfare officer. And these were used to jam enemy radar systems, either for offense or defense. And they were designed that they could fly in with the rest of the fleet for deep penetration missions and be survivable. Since they were unarmed, they were expected to either be protected by their brethren or just use acceleration and speed to get out of harm's way, again using the variable geometry wings to their advantage. The plane is about 76 feet long, and the wingspan fully in is 32 feet, and fully expanded, swept out, is 63 feet. Top speed is about Mach 2.2, and max altitude is a hair over 45,000 feet. Not the highest altitude in the world, but this plane was designed to be fast at low altitude, and it had very good terrain following radar for its day. The first squadron to receive it got it in late 1981, and the first elements using these reached initial operational readiness in 1983, meaning that the Raven was available in 1986 for Operation El Dorado Canyon, which was actually the longest bombing mission on record. They flew for over 6 hours to get to their targets, delivered their payload in Libya, and then returned home. Now, of course, the regular Aardvarks were bombers, and this was also a joint operation where the U.S. Navy was operating at different targets, but in the same area. And the EF-111As were there to essentially jam any surface-to-air missiles or other things. And the mission was generally hitting targets was okay, but it was more or less a success. The EF-111A Raven was used again in 1989 over Panama, and these operated in 1991 during the first Gulf War. They provided protection for other Allied aircraft, and much to the Raven's credit, no Allied aircraft were lost to Iraqi fighters or SAMs or anything else while a Raven was on station. There's a funny story that on January 17, 1991, an EF-111A Raven had an unofficial kill when it forced an Iraqi Mirage F-1 to crash into the desert floor while maneuvering. But this is an unsubstantiated, unverified claim, and some recent testimony puts doubt on it. Also, some recent evidence unearthed in Iraq after the fall of the Saddam regime. Anyway, it's a story. A less entertaining one on February 13th, 1991, the only Raven lost in Iraq occurred, and the pilot and electronics officer did not survive. This was only the third Aardvark to be lost in U.S. Air Force service, and the first to take its crew down with it. Some say that it was avoiding an Iraqi fighter. Others claim that there was no Iraqi fighter in the area. Probably the truth is somewhere in the middle. Either way, there were efforts to update the Raven in the late 80s and early 90s, giving it a new digital cockpit, updating the radar systems, the electronics, of course, and they were reasonably successful. And the planes continued to be used for different operations. For example, Northern Watch, Southern Watch operation, Give Comfort in the 1990s. So they still did their station. But because of budget cuts post-Cold War, just like a lot of Navy planes, the Air Force had to retire some early, and the Raven was one such. The last planes serving overseas were in Saudi Arabia, and they were ordered home in April of 1998. And then stateside, the last squadron flying the Raven was in New Mexico, and they handed the keys for their Ravens in at the beginning of May, and then the fleet was officially retired the following month. And all were put into mothball, I should say the mothball fleet. And yeah, that was it. Probably not what they were expecting when they designed the F-111 in the early 60s. But it did it well because it could lift the payload. The electronic suite that this used weighed over 6,000 pounds. Again, we're talking 70s era electronics here, so it's not really surprising. But of course, by the late 90s, there have been new and better things. The U.S. Navy kind of went through something similar when they had to retire their EA-6s, which I guess would be this aircraft's nearest counterpart, maybe? Yeah, it is an interesting story, and we will continue that in the second part to this video. Just so you know, like any hobby master, this has opening canopy with the removable figures. It has moving wings that are geared together, so if you move one, the other one moves. It has the option of landing gear up or down. It's quite heavy. It's pretty much all metal, including the wings. It doesn't come with any weapons because, well, it's a Raven. It does come with optional external fuel tanks, but I kind of left it off this one because, in reality, the plane actually had quite a bit of internal fuel storage to begin with, and I kind of like the clean look of it. The only gripe I have about this model is actually the stand. Well, the top part actually plugs into the plane just fine. The bottom part is their typical small base, and why they didn't use the larger base like they do on their F-14 Tomcats is beyond me, because this is actually a little bit bigger of an aircraft than a Tomcat, and while the plane on the stand is okay, the base is kind of wobbly. So if you get one of these, my advice, because the stem is metal, I would glue, and I do glue, the top of the stand to the metal stem, not the plane obviously, but I've found that if you don't do that, the metal wears on the plastic of the cradle, and eventually it tips rearward, especially if you keep your wings swept back because of the imbalance. But if you put a little glue on, it's generally speaking good to go. And this model came out, the Raven, late in 2019, and they're actually releasing another variation pretty soon. But pretty neat. I like electronic warfare aircraft. Alright, well, in part 2, we will talk about the Aardvark in Australian service, which is actually the final user of the aircraft. So with that, if you have any questions, please post them. And as always, if you could, like, share, and subscribe. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.